I'm not sure.
May I add that we're recording this meeting as usual. So if you feel uncomfortable with being on the recording, then you can ask some questions at the end, because we'll stop recording when Christian stops his presentation.
Are you seeing my slides now? Is that working? All right, all good. So thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here and present this work. As Kasia said, it's a mega study that I've now been working on for quite some time. It continues to take a lot of my time. It's still in the process of being written up, but at least today I have here the full results to present you. I know I've seen some people in the audience might have already seen some of this work, but at least now we have like the whole sample and everything. So I'm very excited to present this. And I'll just start out with showing you the consortium or the author list for this paper, because there was a lot of people involved in this. I see even someone in the audience is involved here as co-authors, right? And what I want to just stress also here, that this project was really only possible due to this, like, of course, the amount of work that people put in, but also this vast interdisciplinarity of the people that are involved in this work. We have people from decision-making work, we have people from economics, political science, social psychology, that all went together to work on this problem and this project. All right, so what is this work about? And I apologize a little bit for my voice. Have a little bit of a sore throat, but I'll hopefully manage through. So as some of you might know, economic inequality has been rising for decades across the modern world. It seems to only increase, basically. And in the United States specifically, which we focus on in this project, the wealthiest top 0.1%, the group that we call the ultra-rich, now own almost as much wealth as the bottom 90% of American families. So this distribution of wealth in terms of economic inequality is extremely skewly distributed, right? It is really the top 0.1% that captures a lot of this wealth. And I just recently found this even more horrifying statistic, right? That in 2024 alone, $1 trillion of wealth was created just for the 19 richest American households, which is more than the value of the entirety of Switzerland's economy, right? So this extreme concentration of economic resources, we know in the hands of this very small elite, has substantial negative consequences for societies and individual behavior. And just to kind of motivate that, we know that extreme economic inequality has been robustly linked to reduced social mobility, reduced economic growth, erosion of democracy, diminished political participation, increased political polarization, erosion of social cohesion and trust, intensification of financial hardship for the poor, increased crime and violence, poorer health outcomes, worsening of educational outcomes, and increased environmental degradation, just to kind of name a few, right? So it really seems that this economic inequality is not only eroding our economic system, right, but also comes with tons of negative outcomes or consequences of this skewed distribution of resources. This is also what we call negative externalities, right, of inequality. So what are these externalities from inequality that basically happen as a function of those, right? But I think I just want to make the point here as well, and we've been thinking about it a lot about this in the project as well, right? That these consequences really underscore a pivotal issue here, because we know that anything concerning economic inequality, and I'm being very much aware about that we talk about extreme economic inequality here, is quite often framed as a very liberal agenda, right? Like reducing economic inequality is very often framed in liberal terms. But it's very important to know that the challenges that is posed by economic inequality in this setting that we are seeing now, right, really transcends political ideologies. So, of course, if you're a liberal, extreme economic inequality violates these principles of egalitarianism, emphasizing equality of outcome, the way that wealth is distributed, and of course, these fairness concerns within a society. But the argument here is also that if you're conservative, right, extreme economic inequality, as we're seeing it today, is really problematic because it undermines economic growth, it undermines social mobility, and thereby it basically erodes equal opportunities, right, and personal freedoms. So this is not only something we should care about from a liberal point of view, but basically across the political spectrum. We also know, primarily from the economics literature, that one very effective way to curb this growing concentration of wealth, and this is really what I'm talking about, right? That the wealth that we're seeing in society is concentrating among a very small group of people, that one effective way to reduce this is through redistributive policies, and specifically policies that target wealth and capital, so wealth and capital taxes. And to give you an example here, and this is also important because we are using this as an outcome in our Megastudy, there has, of course, been different suggestions about implementing a wealth tax in the United States. And one of such proposals is this one that I'm showing here, namely that a progressive annual wealth tax of only 2% on households with a net worth above $50 million, and then an additional 1% tax on net worth above $1 billion, which would basically affect 100,000 American households, could raise basically around $3 trillion over a 10-year budget period. Of course, because the concentration of wealth is so vast among this very, very small group. But we also know from the literature, both in social psychology, economics, and political science, that support for these kind of redistributive policies tends to be quite low. And the evidence on what triggers them and so on is very mixed at the point of time, I would say. So we know, for instance, that prior work has shown that support for these kind of policies can be influenced by a wide variety of factors. And this might, of course, not come as a surprise to this audience, right? But political attitudes and polarization is one fundamental factor that really influences how people think and act on these redistributive policies, but also something like psychological biases, trust in government. So can the government actually effectively redistribute? There is a large work on envy and self-interest into whether you're supporting redistributive policies or not. There's also a very large literature, primarily in political science and economics, on these deservingness considerations. So who's deserving of this kind of wealth? And also, of course, something like one's own socioeconomic position is a very, very high predictor of support for redistribution. And then there is this quite large literature, which I'm also working quite a bit on, namely these subjective perceptions of inequality. So not necessarily whether you have correct perceptions of where you are in the income or the wealth ranking, right? But this subjective perception of how much inequality are you seeing in the society that you're living in or in your everyday life, basically. So building on this work, we have also seen a substantial amount of work from across the social sciences, basically, that has investigated using these different biases and dimensions to target specific interventions aiming at increasing individual support for redistribution. And this is both within the lab, but there is actually also quite a lot of work in the field on this. And it seems on a general level that some of these interventions seem to be effective in increasing support for redistribution. We are still looking at quite small effect sizes, but some of these, for instance, informational treatments or treatments that really highlight emotional salience of this can actually increase support for redistribution. Of course, we don't know how long the effects last. But there is also substantial heterogeneity in their effectiveness. So in some of these studies, sometimes redistribution is really only influenced to a very minimal degree. There is also times where it's not influenced at all. And then there is cases where it, to some degree, basically backfires. So it even decreases support for redistribution among certain demographics. And building on this, you'd say, very mixed evidence and large levels of heterogeneity in this literature, this project basically just asks what kind of interventions matter the most in shaping people's redistributive preferences. So the way that we go about and try to answer this question is that we employ a Megastudy. And for some of you that might not know what this is, I'm just going to do a short recap on what a Megastudy is. It is basically this very large experimental study that tests multiple different interventions in parallel on the same outcome variables and on the same population with the same control condition. All of it is the same. The only thing we vary is basically the treatments, right? So it comes closer to this kind of, you could say, apple-to-apple comparison in a way. And the idea is that it's really beneficial for a very applied problem because we can enable basically this identification of what is the most effective intervention. The way that I like to think about this is that it's basically kind of like a horse race, right? You're putting a lot of treatments up against each other and seeing which of these treatments is the most effective one. Another cool thing is that it also addresses this methodological comparability problem between often a bunch of different individual investigations, right? So people doing separate studies altogether. Here we are doing everything in the same study, which the argument is that it should, in theory, right, increase the pace of discovery and boost policy relevance of these treatments. And then what I really find fascinating about this is also that it really allows for a truly interdisciplinary investigation of a pressing problem, right? Because what we are doing in this case, and as I also started my talk by saying, right, that we are bringing together experts from different disciplines to basically collaborate with each other. And it really highlights, you know, what are ways of doing things within different disciplines in the social sciences. All right. So to the study itself, the basic setup is very simple. It's a between subjects design with one manipulated factor, but this factor just has 21 levels. So the way that it looks is like this. So this is our specific study. The participants in our study, and I'll of course explain you everything on what our outcomes are and so on afterwards, but the participants in our study come in, they sign an informed consent, and then we give them a definition of what wealth is. To do this, we also employ a comprehension check. So if participants fail to identify the definition of wealth 3 times, they are excluded from participating in the study. After having successfully gone through this comprehension check, we then randomize 35,000 people into 21 conditions. So we always have 5,000 people in the null control condition. In this condition, participants don't see any treatment. They just immediately go on to our outcomes. But then in these 20 other conditions, people are exposed to our crowdsourced interventions. And there are 1,500 in each of these interventions. Then they go to the primary outcomes, secondary outcomes. We have some variables that talk more to mechanisms. These are the tertiary variables. And then we do a quality check in the end. So we end up with a full sample around 35,000 people. For our primary outcome, so this is what we are most interested in, is of course general support for redistribution. So here we adapt this measure that has been used over and over again in some of these large surveys like the European Value Survey or European Social Survey and other kinds of this survey, which is the United States government should take measures to reduce differences in wealth level. So here we specify which government we're talking about, and then we specify that we are talking about wealth. And participants answer this on a 1 to 7 point Likert scale. So this is what we term general support for redistribution. Then the second outcome that participants see is support for redistribution for the wealthiest 0.1% via this wealth tax that I outlined before. So in this specific question, participants are exposed to a small description of what this wealth tax entails. It's framed in a very bipartisan manner. It's just only the description of what this wealth tax is. And then they answer to what degree they would like to support this wealth tax. Then finally, because we are interested in also looking forward, right, in not only trying to understand these attitudes, but maybe getting somewhat closer to a behavioral measure, we have constructed a website that will have, of course, all of the data from the study on there. But on this website, people can decide to basically post a public, but of course still anonymous statement where they can show that they're in support or in opposition to a wealth tax aimed at the 0.1% wealthiest. And this is some kind of measure that we are, or this is the measure that we're trying to use to get somewhat closer to a behavioral outcome. As I said before, we focus specifically on this progressive wealth tax because it has really been argued to be the most powerful tool here when we're really looking at the restricting the concentration of wealth at the top 1%, right? So it's a more powerful tool than income, estate, or corporate taxes to address this issue of wealth concentration because it doesn't go after the flow, instead it goes after the stock of capital. Then for our more psychological outcomes, these are grouped in our secondary outcomes. So here we used a fairly recent scale from Schmaler and Heine, which focuses specifically on these more descriptive versus normative beliefs about inequality. So the first is the subjective perceptions of inequality. So what kind of inequality you are seeing in the society that you're living. The second part of that scale is these unfairness concerns over wealth disparities. So more normative beliefs about how fair is it that these resources are distributed the way they are. And then finally, we have this ISPP measure, which is how concerned are people over the wealth disparities that they see in the world today. For our tertiary variables, as we call them, we have both some variables that focus on mechanisms, but also some more exploratory stuff where we basically measure everything from partisan animosity to fairness of the economic system, how people see social mobility, how people judge how wealth accumulation is happening, whether it's very situational versus dispositional, the purpose of the government, should the government, for instance, redistribute, is there any kind of personal gain that they could achieve from redistribution happening, whether they are registered to vote, what their political ideology are, and so on. And then, of course, also these measures concerning trust. So there has been large arguments in this literature around that people don't support redistribution because they don't trust that the government is capable of effectively redistributing. So we run this study through the panel provider YouGov, and that allows us to also get a very extensive line of pre-treatment background variables on demographics. So we have tons of background demographic variables on, for instance, race and household incomes, available incomes, education, what kind of employment people have, even in their voting behavior, whether they voted for Trump or not, and these kind of things, which we specify in all of the models, which I'll get to in just a second. After the main study that we employ, we have what we call an obfuscated follow-up study. So 3 weeks after participants have completed the main mega study, all of them are invited to a follow-up study. And the reason why this is obfuscated is that it builds on this idea that you are basically inviting people to a study that looks different to the main study. So there's a small level of obfuscation, or you could also call it deception, if you will, that is employed here, where people are invited to a study that concerns how often they use AI things, or AI, this could be ChatGPT and this kind of stuff. And then within these measures, we have hidden basically our primary outcomes as well. So we also ask participants to answer to our outcomes again, but in a rephrased manner. Surprisingly, this approach comes from economics, which is, ultimately against any form of deception, which I find fascinating in this case. But what this allows us to do is that we can not only address, of course, how long these effects last, but we can also really address any concerns there might be about experimental demand effects, right? Because we are having this obfuscated nature of the follow-up study, and we can basically test then, are these questions or these answers and results that we see in the main study, are they only an effect of our treatments, or are they actually durable as well? All right, so let me just briefly talk a bit about the treatments. I won't be able to go through all of the treatments, of course, there is quite a lot. But I want to kind of give you an idea of what this process entails. So as you saw, we have 53 authors on this paper. And the way that this works is that or the core group that is a part of the study basically invited experts from across the social sciences working on this topic to suggest and collaborate on this project. So after everyone was invited, we asked all collaborators to suggest treatments. And then all collaborators were asked to only submit one specific treatment. And then we all democratically voted on which of the treatments that we should include based on several levels of, or several measures that we use to measure how effective these treatments might be. From this, we created an index, and here you see all of the treatments that were suggested for the project. And the ones that have this little tiny red figure is the ones that ended up being included. So there is very different treatments on, for instance, framing inequality, visualizing inequality. There are videos that show how redistribution has happened before. There is something about illustrating text disparities and so on. But what I'll try to do is that I'll try to tell you about what kind of categories that we have from these treatments, because all of these titles won't say you a lot, but just to kind of show you what we are dealing with here. And feel free to ask any question in between if there's something that is not clear. All right, so we tried to do like some sort of grouping based on the treatments that actually ended up in the study. And we have one group of treatments that we call bipartisan collective action treatments. These are treatments that highlight the importance of this unified effort across political ideologies to address the problem, right? So this can be treatments that present wealth redistribution as beneficial across the political spectrum, or that it's really essential for both conservatives and liberal values. We also have 3 treatments that focus specifically on deservingness. So these are treatments that primarily come from political science that focuses on these deservingness heuristics. So for instance, highlighting these vivid narratives about someone who is an anti-social rich or a pro-social poor, these kind of treatments. We have 3 treatments that we call negative externalities of inequality. So these are treatments that really highlight these negative consequences of inequality. They focus on these broader societal impacts, highlights how, for instance, economic inequality is harming health and overall well-being, these kind of things. We have one treatment that we call, it doesn't make sense that I've said it as a category, but we have one treatment that we call policy effect, basically. And this specific one focuses on what would happen if we basically instigated this specific policy. What could the government, the US government, spend money on in terms of, for instance, social welfare? What kind of positive things in terms of policies will this allow us to actually do? We have one that focuses on social norms. So this is on highlighting that actually there is majority support for a billionaire tax, but also that you can commit to supporting these kind of things. We have 2 treatments that focus on tax justice. So they focus really on the fairness and equity of the tax system, and this thing with that the ultra wealthy, so this 0.1%, tend to pay relatively less in taxes than the majority of the population because they generate their income from capital, right, instead. And then finally, the biggest category is what we call visualizing inequality. So this is a set of treatments that use primarily visual representations to basically enhance understanding and awareness of economic inequality. So as you might know, this distribution is so skewed that it's very, very difficult to understand, right? And we're talking about numbers that are so large in magnitudes that for anyone, it's extremely difficult to actually understand what these mean, right? So these are, for instance, treatments that try to show, compared to a median income, how many median incomes goes into $200 billion. These kind of things to kind of probe information processing around how vast and skewed these distributions are. All right. So that was it for the categories of the treatment. I'll just briefly go through the main analysis that we employ for this kind of project, and then we'll see some results. So actually, the analysis are not super advanced. We used OLS models and logistic regression for the binary outcome, this behavioral support we have, but we predict this by this factor with 21 levels, right? Holding the null control as the baseline. And then we control for all of these extensive demographic information that we have, also voting behavior, partisanship, and so on. The thing that is a little bit different maybe from normal studies is that because we have so many treatments that we compare, then we have to adjust for this false discovery rate, right? So we use this Benjamini-Hochberg procedure where you adjust for multiple comparisons between the treatments. So all p-values are adjusted for that. And then there is also this possibility that in these mega studies, the best performing treatments can be upward biased due to something we call the winner's curse. Basically, that the best treatments can be the best treatments because they are driven by a set of extreme outliers, basically. So we apply this thing it's called the James Stein shrinkage procedure, which is another form of Winsorization, basically, of the estimates. We also equivalence test all treatments against a smallest effect size of interest of a Cohen's d of 0.15. And we do this against a crowdsourced smallest effect size of interest. So in the process of suggesting the treatments for the project, all of our collaborators were asked, what do you find to be the smallest effect size of interest in studying support for redistribution? What is a practical, meaningful effect? And if any effect is below this, then we don't consider it as practically meaningful. So all of the treatments are also tested up against that. So when I present the results in a minute, you will see that there is maybe more treatments that are significant, but these are not necessarily non-equivalent. And I'll try to carefully explain this. Finally, we also try to scale each of the treatment effects as something we call the partisan gap. So we try to say, basically, if we see a difference between Republicans and Democrats, which are notoriously divided on this issue of redistribution, we basically take the difference between these two groups in the null control group, and then we see how much of this difference the treatment reduces this partisan gap with. So we basically scale each of the treatment effects to this gap and can then make claims like that this treatment, for instance, reduces the partisan gap by so and so much. Okay, let's get into it. So for the results, I'm presenting you kind of like our most conservative estimates. So these are our final sample sizes after exclusions for attention checks, quality checks, and so on. So we're dealing with a sample of a little over 30,000 people. And then in this follow-up study, we're able to get back 24,000 people approximately. All right. So if we start looking at the baseline, I should also note here that all of our results are weighted. So we use weighted regressions that are weighted for representativeness because our entire sample is representative to age, gender, and education in the United States. In the baselines, our null control condition, this is what we're looking at in terms of general support for redistribution. So remember, this is measured on a 7-point Likert scale. And actually already we are seeing fairly good support among independents and Democrats, as we would expect, right? But Republicans are, of course, lower here. Same thing goes with support for a specific wealth tax. Interestingly, we actually find here that support in general is higher for the specific billionaire tax. Same thing happens for the open support for a specific wealth tax. So remember this measure where you can decide to support or post a statement of support. We already here see very high support in general. So if we take it on an overall level, we find that for the two Likert scales, so the two attitude measures, we are above the midpoint for both of the scales. There's fairly high support, and there's surprisingly high support for this billionaire tax if we look at it overall. But what might all of these treatments do then? This is what they do. So we find that we have a large selection of treatments that actually are quite effective in increasing support for redistribution. I wasn't expecting it to be this strong, but actually we have 12 out of 20 treatments that significantly and effectively increase support for redistribution. And these are the 12 ones from the top down, right? While you might still see that some of these treatments have a lower Cohen's d than 0.15, this is of course because they're not within the equivalence bounds of a Cohen's d of 0.15. So they are still considered non-equivalent. But let me try to talk a little bit about some of the treatments that are effective. I won't have the time to go through all of them, but if we, for instance, take the one that we see the biggest effect for in terms of general support for redistribution, this is a 2-minute video that we call Video Against Feeling of Futility. This is a short illustrational video that tries to show how redistribution has actually happened before in the United States. So how, for instance, progressive income taxes helped redistribute resources and made America very prosperous in the 50s and the 60s, for instance. For the 2 treatments that come after this, we have 2 of these deservingness treatments that are sourced from primarily political science. So the first one is a news article that shows a undeserving rich, as we would say. So a story about Leona Helmsley. She was termed to be the queen of mean, this like very, very antisocial rich person. She gifted her entire fortune away to her dog. And this is contrasted in the same news article, and this is a real news article, with a what we would call a deserving poor. So a father that really struggles to pay for education for her daughter. The third one uses the similar narrative, but takes this deserving poor out of there, so only uses this undeserving rich. And then I'll just note a little bit about the next 2 ones. So elite Qs is, you could say, kind of an opposite deservingness Q. Because as you might think, these deservingness Qs are, or deservingness heuristics are very negatively framed, right? They're really focusing on antisocial rich people. And there is a possibility that they could only increase polarization around these issues. Elite Qs is a little bit different because it is an open letter from this Proud to Pay More initiative. So it's this consortium of ultra rich people that every year go to the World Economic Forum and ask policymakers, please tax us. They have written this very extensive letter around how they would basically like to be taxed. And this apparently seems to be quite effective as well. And we have thought a little bit about why might this be, and it could be, right, that not a lot of people actually know about that these things exist, that there is a fairly large group of ultra-rich people that actively advocate for capital taxes. Before we move on to the specific measure, I just want to note this one, this treatment 6. So this is a visual illustration of inequality. And this is really these very agnostic treatments that try to just re-visualize or rescale what inequality looks like. So try to show our participants how the very skewed distribution of wealth inequality in the United States, how that could be illustrated differently. So for instance, this thing of that the majority of the population has barely any wealth, while this very small group takes up the entire wealth of the society. All right. Even though you might see this treatment down here, I don't know if you can see my mouse, can you? But the final treatment in the end, even though it looks like it backfires, in 2-sided test, it doesn't backfire. So none of the treatments actually backfire for real. All right. So there was general support for redistribution. If we move on to support for a specific wealth tax, the first interesting thing to note is that we don't see the same treatments work. So the treatments shuffle around basically, and we are also seeing much smaller effect sizes. So this is to be expected. And in this literature, we often find that when we ask about very specific policies, then we see very different effect sizes, much smaller effect sizes. So here you really see that this exemplar of an undeserving ultra-rich American, this deservingness Q, is really the winner. That is the one that seems to be the most effective here. But just following that, we again see this elite Qs thing, right? So this more positively framed deservingness Q. The next ones after treatment number 3 here, so this I just want to focus a little bit on, is again 2 treatments that try to visualize inequality. The first one is this illustration of Jeff Bezos' wealth that some of you might have seen before. It's a computer graphic that shows 1 pixel as $1,000. Then you see how many pixels go into a median income in the United States. You see how many pixels is $1 million. And then you see how many pixels is Jeff Bezos' fortune. And this is going to take a long time to scroll through. Participants have 2 minutes where they can look at this. but actually this is also the treatment that we find that the participant spends the longest amount of time on. So people are really fascinated by this treatment. They spend on average 10 minutes looking at this treatment. The same thing goes for the next one just below here. This is again trying to frame inequality around a wealthy group. So it, first of all, frames inequality not around a specific person, so not around Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, but it shows how the inequality or the wealth that the richest in society capture has grown from the 1990s to 2024, and how this growth in wealth can then be illustrated. All right. Then we'll move on to open support for wealth tax. So as you will see here, there is no effects really that trigger increased in open support for wealth tax. So the way that we have coded this measure, right, is that participants are asked to say, would you like to post a message in support? Would you like to post a message in opposition? Or would you not like to post a message at all? As you also saw from the descriptives in the null control group, we find overall very high support. So there's like almost 65% that actually want to support this. So want to post a message in support. When we pre-registered the analysis for this study, we basically did it so that the dummy outcome that you're seeing here is whether people want to support, and then the zeros is the people who want to oppose or don't want to post. If we take out the people that don't want to post, and we don't know why they don't want to post, right? It could be due to anonymity reasons or whatnot, then we actually are still able to find an effect. So if we only look at the people that want to oppose or support a wealth tax openly on our website, we again find that two treatments are very effective. There are more that are significant, but the two top ones, elite Qs and illustrating Bezos' wealth, can even increase this more than the baseline, right? So it might not be a lot, but they can increase the probability to support a supportive statement by around 1% here. And this is, of course, because we have a very, very high baseline already. Okay, so these are the results from the main study. So now, of course, the interesting thing is to begin to also look at what might then happen in this follow-up study. So what might happen when we ask people 3 weeks after. And a little interesting disclaimer here is that when we initially pre-registered and set everything up with YouGov, YouGov promised me that they would be able to field this study within 2 weeks. After the results came back, it turned out that it took them 3 weeks to field. So the results that you'll see is the follow-up study 3 weeks after people participated in the main study. After I found out, I was like, okay, maybe let's hope that the effects last. And a lot of the effects actually do seem to last, which is very interesting. So of the 12 treatments that significantly increase general support for redistributions, we find that 9 treatments remain significant and non-equivalent in the follow-up study. Among these 9 treatments, 8 of them retained between 40 to 80% of their estimated effect size. So as you'll see, right, for instance, something like video against feeling of futility decreases quite a bit in effect size, but still retains a significant and positive effect size. What is really interesting is that some of these treatments actually stay fairly close to their original effect size. So they seem to be, to some degree, durable. They don't vanish away. And this is at least the first argument for that these kind of survey treatments that we employ, even though they're very simple, then they can potentially actually influence people's preferences in somewhat of a longer term. So it's not just an experimental demand effect that we're seeing. The effects seem to stay even closer when we look at support for specific wealth tax. So of the 5 treatments that were effective in the main study, the ones that were significant and non-equivalent, we find that 4 remain significant and non-equivalent in the follow-up study. And these effects actually retain more of their effect compared to what we saw before. So here we find that these 4 treatments retain around 60 to 84% of their estimated original effect size. All right. So when we then finally look at partisan gaps, we find that I'm just going to briefly talk about these scaling effects, right? So we find that general support for redistribution, this treatment you saw with the video, this treatment can actually reduce the partisan gap between Democrats and Republicans by 25%, which is quite substantial, right? So what we're doing here is that this treatment effect is also pushing really Republicans to increase their support for redistribution on a general level. Similarly, we find for support for a specific wealth tax, here we're looking at a partisan gap reduction of close to 18%. So again, quite substantial reductions. In our exploratory part of also our paper and our pre-registration, we talked about that some of these treatments could potentially also have negative spillover effects, right? So you can begin to imagine that if you have treatments that focus, for instance, specifically on deservingness, there is a potential that these treatments could spill over into more effective polarization, for instance. Or if you have treatments that highlight inequality, this could also increase sentiments around that people don't trust that the government can effectively redistribute. So we ran some exploratory analysis testing this, and we basically find that none of our treatments decrease generalized trust or trust in governments, and none of them increase effective polarization. So we measure effective polarization using these thermometer statements and then couple that with people's partisanship. So just wrapping up here, it seems that redistributive preferences are actually highly elastic, and this is what our study also confirms, which confirms these, we call them malleability majority models, right? That political preferences surrounding redistributions are actually malleable and they can be pushed in the direction, right? Especially deservingness cues, these elite cues, and then these scale visualizations coupled with these bipartisan collective action frames seem to be able to robustly support and increase support for redistribution, right? A little fun side note here, I didn't include this, but we ran some machine learning models that try to basically test if a combination of treatments could be more effective. And we use these causal forests that basically take all of these different background demographics and then use that to create a set of portfolio of treatments. And here we actually find exactly this, that if you couple, for instance, a deservingness treatment with visualizations and these elite cues, then there is a possibility, of course, this is an exploratory analysis, right, that these could be even more effective on both of the outcomes. Okay, that was just a side note. But what we show here is also, and I don't think I have so much time to show this as well, but what these treatments do is that they really shift, of course, fairness norms, but they again also increase these subjective perceptions of inequality. And this is important to note here because in this literature, there's this large argument, right, that we have very different fairness ideas about inequality. But what is really predictive of support for redistribution, for instance, is these subjective perceptions of inequality. And we can also show that we, to some degree, are helping to basically reduce these misperceptions about the scale of inequality. It seems, and this fits very well with the prior literature as well, right, that gains are substantially larger for broad redistribution than for this specific wealth tax. And this really aligns with a lot of the work on that there seems to be this policy-specific discounting, right? It's much more polarized when you talk about specific taxes. But on a more positive note, I think like these are, of course, very, very simple treatments. They're fielded in an online study, right? And there is a potential here that these could be used as low-cost communication interventions, right? If an NGO, for instance, want to really work on this. Yeah. So that's all I had. And now I'm very much looking forward to hear your questions about this.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you.